The landscape of the late 8th century stretched wide and silent under a vast unyielding sky. It was an age where the rhythm of human life was inextricably bound to the turning of the seasons, a slow, deliberate cadence that dictated the boundaries of existence. In the remote corners of the Frankish lands between the years 790 and 800, the world felt heavy with the weight of the earth. The air during those spring mornings held a particular crispness, a lingering coolness that spoke of winter's slow retreat, yet carried the faint, earthy promise of the thawing soil. In the valleys where the mist clung to the low-lying hills like a soft, translucent veil, life revolved around the sturdy wooden structures that anchored the village. These were the storehouses built from timber hewn from the surrounding forests, their walls seasoned by the relentless passage of sun and rain. These barns were the silent witnesses to the struggles of those who toiled within them. To walk past these structures was to hear the gentle settling of old wood, a low creaking sound that blended with the rustle of the wind moving through the nearby copses of oak and elm. It was a world of muted colours, the silver grey of weathered shingles, the deep, mossy greens of the damp undergrowth, and the rich, dark brown of the furrowed earth that waited, dormant, for the return of the sun. But within the quietude of these rural settlements, a subtle, pervasive anxiety began to take root. It was not a noise nor a sudden event, but a slow, creeping shadow that deepened with the setting of each sun. For the farmers, whose hands were calloused and stained by the very soil they worked, the storehouse was meant to be a sanctuary of certainty. It was supposed to be the place where the future, in the form of dried dormant seeds, lay tucked away waiting for the proper moment to be returned to the earth. Yet, during this particular era, that promise of certainty had begun to fray at the edges. The cycles of the previous years had been unkind. They were marked by extremes, periods where the sky remained stubbornly clear, baking the earth into hard, fractured plates, followed by seasons of relentless rain that turned the fields into quagmires and sent the rivers spilling over their banks. The natural order, the reliable clockwork of planting and reaping, had been disrupted. As a consequence, the precious grain, the lifeblood of the community, had been handled with a desperation that left little room for the meticulous care required for future survival. In the dim light of the granaries, where the air was thick with the scent of dried dust and the faint, nutty aroma of stored grain, the reality of the crisis manifested in the barrels. These were large, heavy vessels bound with iron hoops that had grown dark with oxidation. Inside them, the grains had become a chaotic tapestry of uncertainty. Wheat, intended for the lighter, better-drained slopes, had been mingled with barley and hardier rye. The precise distinctions that mattered so dearly to the health of the upcoming crop had been lost in the frantic rush to save what could be salvaged from the floods and the droughts. As evening descended, casting long, elongated shadows across the floorboards of the homes, the farmers would sit in the flickering amber glow of their hearths. They would stare into the embers, their minds wandering to the storehouses. They felt the burden of their own ignorance. They did not possess the scrolls or the ink-stained parchments of the scholars and the monks. They only had their own hands and the collective memory of their elders. The thought of reaching into a barrel and pulling out a handful of grain, only to find that it was the wrong variety for their specific patch of earth, or worse, that the seeds had begun to wither from the damp, was a phantom that haunted their quiet hours. It was a weight that pressed upon their spirits, a loss of direction, and a slow, aching erosion of their trust in the systems that were meant to sustain them. They longed for order, for a way to read the secrets of the grain without the need for written words, and for the reassurance that the coming spring would not be met with the same bitter, disorienting gamble. The seasons of the late 8th century had become a puzzle, one that the inhabitants of the rural lands found increasingly difficult to solve. The cycle of the heavens, the path of the sun and the patterns of the wind seemed to have shifted, bringing with it a succession of environmental trials that tested the endurance of every living thing. There were seasons etched deeply into the memory of the elders, where the rains simply ceased to fall. The sky would remain a pale, unwavering expanse of blue for weeks on end, until the earth cracked in jagged, hungry fissures. In these times, the ponds retreated into muddy hollows, and the dust rose in lazy golden plumes whenever a footfall disturbed the path. Following these desiccated months, the weather would often swing with a violent, dramatic grace into the opposite extreme. The clouds would gather, heavy and bloated with the scent of ozone and wet stone, and then break upon the land in torrents that lasted for days. These were not the gentle, nourishing showers of spring, but relentless, soaking downpours that turned the valley floors into soft, shifting marshes. The rivers, once placid ribbons of silver, would swell and surge, reclaiming the lowlands where the farmers had carefully placed their storehouses and granaries. The wood of these buildings, constantly caught between the expansion of moisture and the contraction of the sun, began to warp and groan. It was during these moments of climatic upheaval that the integrity of the grain storage truly began to fail. When the water levels rose, threatening to spill over the threshold, the farmers were forced into a hurried, frantic labor. There was no time for the calm, methodical sorting that defined the ideal practice of agriculture. Seeds that had been stored with care in distinct, labeled ceramic jars or separate wooden partitions were suddenly uprooted. Everything, the resilient, sun-hardened wheat, the pale, delicate barley, and the dark, hardy rye, was scooped into the largest, most readily available barrels. These containers, often meant for the coarse storage of winter hay or animal feed, were not designed to preserve the purity of a crop. Inside these deep cylindrical depths, the grains became an undifferentiated mass. The moisture from the damp air clung to the husks, creating a stagnant environment where rot could easily take hold. The farmers, moving through the gloom of the storehouse with the soft scraping sound of their leather boots against the dirt floor, knew that the contents of these barrels were a mystery. They would plunge their hands into the cool, dry depths, pulling out a handful of seeds to inspect in the fading light. Sometimes they would find the telltale evidence of weevils, the tiny, ruinous guests that thrived in the dark, crowded spaces. At other times they found only the dust and the broken chaff of a failed season, mixed in with the viable seeds. The deterioration of these storage practices was more than a mere loss of food. It was a loss of language. To the medieval farmer, the seed was a promise, a dialogue between the earth and the hand that tended it. When the varieties were mixed, when the specific identity of the grain was lost to the chaos of survival, that dialogue was broken. They were left to wonder which seed belonged to the rocky, well-draining soil of the northern hillside, and which was meant for the rich, damp loam of the valley floor. The fear of sowing incorrectly, of watching a harvest wither because the wrong grain had been placed in the wrong cradle of earth, became a constant underlying hum of anxiety. This was not a fear of immediate conflict or sudden calamity, but a deeper, quieter dread of a slow, inevitable hunger that would arrive if the cycle of order could not be restored. The grain stores had become places of confusion, filled with the potential for life, yet shrouded in the paralyzing fog of uncertainty, waiting for a clarity that the current administration could not provide. The channel is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. As the shadows lengthened across the thatch-roofed dwellings, the psychological weight of the winter began to settle heavily upon the community. Inside these modest homes, the hearth was the center of existence, the dying embers casting flickering, dancing silhouettes against the rough-hewn timber walls. Here, in the quiet hours before sleep claimed them, the farmers would find themselves grappling with a profound sense of instability. The uncertainty regarding their grain stores was not merely a logistical problem. It was a thief of peace reaching into the moments that were meant for rest. The nights were long and profoundly still. In the village, the air outside was filled with the rhythmic, steady sounds of the countryside, the occasional hoot of an owl in the dense canopy of the nearby woods, the soft, melancholic rustle of wind through the dried thatch, and the distant, muffled sound of a stream flowing over smooth, cold stones. Yet, within the homes, the silence felt different. It was an expectant, heavy silence, filled with the unspoken thoughts of families wondering what the coming spring would demand of them. Each farmer would lie upon their straw-filled mattress, staring up at the dark rafters, their minds inevitably wandering back to the heavy wooden barrels in the storage barns. They would visualize the grain, the way the different varieties had been stirred together in the heat of the past season's panic. They saw in their mind's eye the dark, damp corners of the granaries where the moisture crept in through the cracks in the wood, and the tiny, persistent movements of the insects that claimed the stored life as their own. It was a vision that triggered a low, persistent thrum of anxiety. The fear was not of the present, but of the future. It was the fear of the barren field, a prospect that carried the weight of history and the echo of tales passed down through generations. To a person who lived by the turning of the seasons, the field was not just soil, it was a testament to the effort and care of the hands that worked it. To scatter seed into the earth without knowing its nature, to plant a moisture-loving barley in a parched, sun-drenched hill, or to bury the drought-resistant wheat in the heavy, waterlogged mud of the low-lying valley, was to invite failure, and failure meant the slow creeping spectre of hunger that could quiet a household and empty a village. This state of mind was a delicate, fragile thing. The farmers had lost the simple, grounded confidence that comes from a clear and predictable rhythm of life. When they closed their eyes, they did not see the promise of a golden harvest. Instead, they felt the disorienting sensation of having lost their compass. They felt a sense of alienation from their own vocation, as if the land itself were becoming a stranger, a vast, indifferent expanse that required an understanding they no longer possessed. Every creak of the roof beams, every shifting of the wind against the door, seemed to amplify this sense of displacement. They were people who lived by the touch, the scent, and the subtle shifts in the air, and yet they were currently navigating a world where these senses provided no answers. The reliance on the collective, the faith that the leadership, the stewards and the lords, would manage the bounty with wisdom, had been eroded by the visible mismanagement of the grain. They felt abandoned to their own devices, forced to face the daunting prospect of the spring thaw with nothing but a collection of mystery seeds and a deep, gnawing apprehension. It was a time of internal, quiet turmoil, a landscape of the heart as troubled as the weather-beaten fields that awaited the plough, all waiting for a spark of order, for a voice or a hand to bring structure back to the chaos of their daily survival. The grain stores were the silent architectural hearts of the rural estates, standing as weathered monuments to the necessity of harvest. Built of sturdy hand-hewn oak and pine, these structures had been designed to breathe. Their walls, constructed with a technique of stacking thick planks, allowed for the slow passage of air, intended to prevent the accumulation of moisture that might rot the precious reserves within. The roofs, thatched with thick golden straw gathered from the previous year's harvest, sloped steeply to shed the heavy rains that often battered the countryside during the transition between the seasons. Inside, the architecture was one of profound simplicity. Deep, wide bins made of cedar and pine lined the walls, and the central space was often dominated by large circular barrels, some held together with rusted iron hoops, others reinforced with tightly bound willow strips. Stepping across the threshold of such a storehouse was a transition into a space defined by a different kind of time. The air here was always cool, holding a slight dry chill even on the warmest of spring afternoons. It was a space defined by the scent of earth, of dried wood, and most predominantly the dusty, sweet and nutty perfume of grain. Yet, as the years of instability left their mark, the internal character of these storehouses had undergone a subtle, distressing transformation. The orderly rows that had once defined the space, the clear, dedicated sections for different cereals, had surrendered to a haphazard, cluttered reality. To touch the grain in these barrels was to confront a tactile history of confusion. A hand plunged into a barrel might encounter the smooth, hard surface of a kernel of wheat, only to be met immediately with the rougher, slightly coarser texture of rye, and perhaps the damp, soft grain of an inferior, moisture-damaged barley. The sensation was one of grit and unevenness. One could feel the presence of unwanted debris, the small, sharp pieces of broken husk, the fine powdery dust that suggested the grain had been tossed and turned too many times. and even the occasional chilling hardness of small inorganic matter that had been swept into the bins during the rush to clear the flooded floors. The barrels themselves, meant to be containers of potential life, now felt like vessels of uncertainty. There was no tactile indicator of what lay beneath the surface. For a farmer whose entire understanding of the land was filtered through the sensitivity of the fingertips, this was deeply unsettling. They were accustomed to recognizing the quality of a crop by the way it felt when poured from a sack, the weight of the kernels as they slid over the skin, the coolness of the healthy grain, and the subtle resistance of a good hearty variety. Now that sensory shorthand was gone. As they worked, the sound of the grain was no longer a steady rhythmic pouring. It was a confused, irregular clatter. There was a lack of harmony in the way the different seeds collided. The farmers would spend long, tedious hours attempting to sift through the mixtures, their fingers growing tired and numb from the repetition. They would try to sort them by color or shape in the dim, filtering light that managed to find its way through the narrow gaps in the wall timbers. But the light was never enough, and their eyes were weary. The physical reality of the storehouse, once a place of pride and organized labor, had become a site of quiet manual struggle. Every interaction with the grain was a reminder of the breakdown of the natural order, a tactile manifestation of the chaos that had beset their lives. It was in this setting, amidst the scent of dry straw and the visual clutter of misplaced seeds, that the deep foundational anxiety of the community found its home, rooted in the very environment that should have offered them comfort and security. The arrival of Queen Fastrada at the outskirts of the farming estate was not marked by the sound of trumpets or the fanfare of a royal procession. Instead, it was defined by a quiet, measured stillness. She moved away from the sheltered, stone-walled comfort of the palace, leaving behind the heavy tapestries and the refined, orderly silence of the royal chambers. She journeyed toward the rural heartland, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the ripening potential of the spring season. Her presence was understated. She arrived as an observer, someone who sought to understand the fabric of her people's lives by witnessing the reality they inhabited every single day. As she stepped into the dimly lit, expansive space of the main storehouse, the atmosphere shifted. The light outside, which had been bright and energetic with the promise of the coming year, was filtered here into soft, muted beams that danced with suspended dust motes. The Queen walked slowly, her footsteps barely audible against the packed dirt floor. She was not a distant figure observing from a position of detached authority. She was a woman of keen perception and quiet action, drawn to the source of the community's unrest. Her eyes, accustomed to the subtle details of her own administrative tasks, scanned the rows of heavy wooden barrels with a focused, analytical precision. She paused beside a large iron-hooped container, the wood of which had darkened with age and humidity. Without hesitation, she reached out. Her hand, slender and practiced in the art of management, descended into the center of the grain. She felt the cool, dry, and irregular texture of the seeds. She felt the grit of the dust and the rough, inconsistent shapes of the mixed cereal varieties. There was a deliberate, almost reverent quality to her touch, as if she were communicating directly with the substance of the harvest itself. She stood there for a long moment, allowing the sensory reality of the storehouse, the smell of aged timber, the cool weight of the seeds, and the surrounding, expectant silence to impress itself upon her. This was not a place of defeat, she realized, but a place of suppressed potential. The disorder was visible, yet it was something that could be met with a new form of organization. She saw the farmers standing at a respectful distance, their expressions a mix of curiosity and a deep, weary apprehension. They had lived with this confusion for so long that they had perhaps ceased to believe it could be otherwise. But the Queen did not see a problem without a solution. She saw the need for a bridge between the complexity of their needs and the simplicity of their tools. She began to envision a method that would not rely on the inaccessible language of the monks, the ink and the parchment that lived in distant libraries, but rather a language that belonged to the hands of the people, a language they already understood. Her mind moved to the straw that lay piled in the corners, the golden dried remains of the harvest. It was a humble, abundant material, tactile and familiar. As she looked at the chaotic barrels and then back at the simple, discarded bundles of straw, the seeds of a new idea began to form. It was a solution that required no education in literacy, only an education in observation and touch. She began to formulate a process that would restore the order of the fields by first organizing the order of the grain. In that quiet storehouse under the soft filtered light of a spring afternoon, the foundation was laid for a transformation that would turn the anxiety of the community into a methodical, disciplined pursuit of abundance. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations, human cultures, and extraordinary journeys through time. To remain within the storehouse for any length of time was to become completely enveloped by its unique, lingering atmosphere. It was a space that lived and breathed, the timber walls acting as a barrier against the changing temperaments of the outside world, yet holding on to the echoes of every season that had passed through its doors. The air was a complex, layered tapestry of scents. There was the profound, grounded smell of ancient, seasoned wood, oak and elm that had been harvested generations ago, their fibers now tightly packed, dry and cool to the touch. This scent was the bedrock of the space, a deep, woody fragrance that spoke of long-standing stability and the slow, inevitable passage of time. Intermingled with the wood was the earthy, mineral tang of the floor, packed soil that had been trodden smooth by countless feet over many decades. It held a subtle moisture, a reminder of the ground from which the grain itself had once risen. When the wind blew from the north, it carried the faint, sharp scent of the damp earth from the fields outside, creeping through the narrow gaps in the wall planks to meet the dryness of the interior. This contrast created a sense of suspension, as if the building were a sanctuary where the outside elements were slowly being processed and refined. But the most pervasive aroma was that of the grain itself. It was a dry, dusty, and strangely comforting scent, a combination of the nutty, sweet fragrance of wheat, the slightly sharper, more vegetal note of barley, and the deep, dark aroma of rye. It was the smell of potential. When one reached into the barrels, the dust would rise in thin, translucent veils, catching the stray shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom. This dust was fine and soft, settling on the skin and clothing, a physical reminder of the intimate connection between the harvester and the harvest. The texture of the storehouse was equally defined. Everything was dry, yet held a subtle, resilient tension. The barrels were rigid and firm, their iron hoops cold and unyielding against the palm. The straw, stacked in corners or left in piles, offered a completely different sensation. It was brittle and light, rustling with a dry, papery sound whenever it was disturbed. When squeezed, the individual stalks would snap with a sharp, delicate click, releasing a concentrated, sweet scent of sun-baked grasses. It was a tactile contrast to the heavy, dense weight of the grain. To move through this space was to engage in a slow, rhythmic dance with these textures. The sound of one's own breathing seemed amplified by the density of the stored bounty, creating a sense of isolation and focus. The silence was not truly empty. It was filled with the faint, almost imperceptible settling of the grain as it shifted within the barrels, a soft, cascading sound like the rustling of dry leaves in an autumn wood. It was a place where one could lose track of the hours, where the outside world became a distant, blurred memory. In this sensory landscape, the Queen's presence was a point of calm, intentional awareness. She did not rush. She allowed herself to experience the environment as the farmers did, feeling the coolness of the wood, the grit of the grain, the dryness of the straw, and the hushed, expectant quiet of the building. She was absorbing the environment, letting the reality of the storage constraints sink into her understanding. The storehouse was a vessel of both uncertainty and opportunity, a place where the chaos of the last few years had left a tangible, textured map of the community's struggle. By deeply experiencing these sensations, the smell of the dry husk, the feeling of the heavy wood, the sound of the shifting seed, she was preparing the mental ground for the system she was about to introduce, a system that would be as tactile and grounded as the storehouse itself. Queen Fastrada stood in the center of the granary, a figure of composed observation. Her gaze traveled across the room, not with the impatient restlessness of one seeking quick answers, but with the focused, rhythmic attention of a weaver watching the warp and weft of a complex tapestry. She watched the way the laborers moved, hesitant, their hands hovering over the barrels with a visible lack of confidence. She saw the way they glanced at one another, a shared, silent communication of doubt that spoke of a deep-seated fear. It was a plight that transcended the simple loss of a harvest. It was the slow, painful dissolution of their identity as stewards of the land. She noted the specific telltale signs of their struggle. The farmers did not have the means to track the varieties by ledger or script, yet they possessed an intuitive physical knowledge that had been neglected. They knew the weight of a good seed, the specific hue of a healthy husk, and the texture of a grain that had been perfectly dried. However, the current system had rendered this knowledge obsolete, forcing them to treat all grains as a singular, nameless mass. Fastrada recognized that the problem was not one of intellect but of accessibility. The system of storage had become a barrier, an abstract, bureaucratic tangle that left the people disconnected from the very tools they needed to survive. Her analytical process was quiet yet profound. She mentally mapped the requirements of the coming season, the rocky, windswept hills that demanded the deep-rooted strength of wheat, the low-lying, moisture-retaining basins that favored the hardiness of barley, and the peripheral, varied soils that were perfectly suited for the resilience of rye. She understood that if she could simply label these barrels, if she could provide a mark, a sign, or a symbol that was as tangible as the grain itself, she could restore the farmer's connection to their work. She watched how they handled the straw, their fingers instinctively smoothing and testing the dried stalks. This, she realized, was the key. The straw was more than waste. It was a medium. It was something they possessed in abundance, something they already handled with a natural, unconscious grace. If the labels could be created from the very material of the harvest, if they could be woven into shapes that held meaning, then the information would be accessible to everyone. Regardless of their literacy, it would turn the act of storage into a tactile experience of clarity. She spent long moments in silent contemplation, her eyes tracking the way the light fell on the piles of straw. She was imagining the shapes, the tight, sharp geometry of the diamond, the long, flowing lines of a more relaxed weave. Each shape would correspond to the specific needs of the grain it represented. The transition from the chaos of the mixed barrels to a world of ordered, labelled potential began to take shape in her mind. It was a solution born of necessity, an elegant, human-centered innovation that respected the reality of the people's lives. She was witnessing their plight, not as a tragedy to be lamented, but as a condition to be corrected, a puzzle with a piece already resting in their hands. The air in the storehouse seemed to lighten, reflecting the shift in her own internal perspective as she moved from observation to the silent, confident design of a future where order once again would govern the growth of the fields. The realization did not come as a thunderclap, but as a slow, steady unfolding of thought, much like the gentle blooming of a flower in the quiet of the morning. As the afternoon sun began to retreat, leaving the storehouse in a deepening, cool shadow, Fastrada sought the small, flickering light of a hanging lantern. The amber glow danced upon the walls, casting elongated, shifting patterns that seemed to mimic the very shapes she had been contemplating. She found a bundle of discarded straw, selecting a few supple stalks that had not yet been trampled or broken. In the quiet, rhythmic silence of the barn, she began to experiment. She held the straw between her fingers, feeling its inherent elasticity, the way it yielded and resisted with a soft, papery friction. To her, this was not just plant matter. It was a medium for communication, a way to imprint human intent onto the chaos of the environment. She started to loop and knot the fibers, her movements fluid and deliberate. She fashioned a tight, compact shape, a diamond, sharp at the corners, firm and resilient. It was a knot that possessed a structural integrity, mirroring the drought-resistant wheat that required a firm, reliable environment to thrive. It felt solid in her hand, a tactile signature of strength. She set that aside and turned to another pair of stalks, twisting them into a loose, elongated braid that tapered away to a graceful point. The movement was fluid, less restrictive, allowing for the straw to breathe and flex. This, she decided, would signify the grains that craved the moisture of the lowlands, those that needed to expand and drink in the richness of the soil. The contrast between the two shapes was immediate and unmistakable. One could tell the difference simply by closing one's eyes and touching the woven form, a language written not in ink but in the memory of the fingertips. This was the genesis of the straw language. It was a system that bypassed the need for formal education, reaching instead toward the innate sensory wisdom that every farmer already possessed. By hanging these woven markers upon the barrels, the storehouse would become a place of legible, orderly purpose. The anxiety that had haunted the community, the fear of the unknown, the dread of the wrong seed in the wrong soil began to dissipate as she refined the shapes. She saw how easily these labels could be reproduced, how a child or an elder could learn the pattern of the knot just as they learned the pattern of the seasons. It was a profound moment of connection, a bridge built of golden straw between the wisdom of the palace and the raw reality of the fields. As the lantern light flickered and died down, leaving the space in a tranquil velvet darkness, Fastrada felt a sense of deep, quiet satisfaction. The system was complete in her mind. She knew that when the sun rose again, the work of transformation could begin in earnest. If these stories of history and human ingenuity bring a sense of calm and inspiration to your quiet hours, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this journey with others. Your support allows us to continue curating these peaceful historical tales for your relaxation. The work ahead would be simple, rhythmic, and restorative, turning the storehouse into a beacon of stability for the coming spring. The chaos was merely a temporary state. The order was waiting to be woven, one strand at a time. The transformation of the storehouse began with the humble rhythmic act of gathering the materials. To weave a language of straw, one first had to understand the straw itself. In the days that followed, the queen and those she had quietly enlisted worked with a sense of focused serenity. They ventured into the storage areas where the previous year's harvest had left behind discarded bundles, and they sought out the cleanest, most resilient stalks of wheat and rye. The process of selection was tactile and intentional. They would pick up a stalk, feeling its length and its suppleness, testing it for any brittle spots that might snap under the pressure of a knot. There was a profound meditative quality to this gathering. The air in the barn was filled with the soft, dry rustle of moving straw, a sound like the gentle lapping of waves against a sandy shore. Each stalk was carefully inspected. If a piece was too coarse or too weathered by the humidity, it was set aside, returned to the pile for other uses. Only the strongest, most flexible fibers were chosen, those that held the golden hue of the sun and the memory of the summer fields. These stalks had been dried to perfection, losing the moisture of their growing days to become lightweight, durable, and ready to be reshaped by the human hand. Once gathered, the fibers were laid out in long, straight rows on the wooden tables, arranged by thickness and length. The process of conditioning the straw was vital. It needed to be just pliable enough to bend without fraying. To achieve this, the workers would sometimes dampen the ends of the stalks with a light mist of water, allowing the fibers to soften, becoming silky and yielding under the warmth of their palms. It was a process that demanded patience, a slow, deliberate pacing that required one to be fully present with the material. The scent of this work was deeply evocative, a dry, sweet, and faintly grassy perfume that seemed to cleanse the atmosphere of the storehouse. It was the smell of the earth's bounty, concentrated and preserved. As the farmers worked, they found themselves falling into a natural cadence. The repetitive motion of sorting, measuring, and preparing the fibers became a form of grounding. There was no need for speech. The task itself spoke the language of stability. Each movement was an investment in the future, a small, tangible action taken to ensure that the chaos of the previous seasons would not repeat itself. The tactile experience of the straw was a reminder of the cycle of growth. To hold these stalks was to hold the essence of the season that had just passed, the strength of the roots, the height of the stalks, and the promise held within the husks. By preparing them for their new purpose as identifiers, the people were participating in a ritual of renewal. They were taking the remnants of the past and crafting from them a tool for the future. The frustration that had once permeated the storehouse began to fade, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of purpose. As the piles of prepared straw grew, so too did the confidence of those who labored. They were not just cleaning a barn, they were building an infrastructure of clarity, one carefully selected, sun-cured stalk at a time. The work was peaceful, methodical, and profoundly reassuring, a quiet prelude to the systematic organization that would soon restore the rhythm of their lives. The creation of the tight diamond knot was a practice in structural discipline, a physical embodiment of the strength required by the wheat that would eventually brave the sun-scorched, arid hillsides. To form this symbol, one had to begin with 4 stalks of equal length, each chosen for its slender, uniform diameter and its ability to withstand tension without cracking. The farmers, now guided by the Queen's design, would hold the stalks together at the base, feeling the way the dry fibers rested against one another. There was a deliberate, almost architectural precision required here. They would begin by crossing the stalks over each other in a series of precise alternating overlaps. As the straw moved through their fingers, it created a series of small, rhythmic clicks, a soft metallic sound that echoed faintly in the rafters. The key to the diamond was the tension. The weaver had to pull each fold firmly into place, creating a knot that was compact, angular, and remarkably dense. As the knot took shape, it transformed from a collection of loose, flexible stalks into a singular, cohesive form that felt solid and unyielding. The texture of the finished diamond was fascinating to the touch. The corners were sharp, biting slightly into the pads of the fingers, while the center was smooth, almost polished by the pressure applied during the weaving. It was a shape that felt inherently sturdy, a tactile declaration of resistance. For the farmers holding this small woven token, the meaning was immediately clear. It did not need to be written in a book or explained in a lecture. When they touched the sharp, firm edges of the diamond, they felt the resilience of the wheat itself, a grain that was built to hold its own against the harsh, drying heat of the summer, a grain that demanded a firm, well-draining soil and a hardy, disciplined hand. This was the beauty of the system. It turned the abstract qualities of a seed into a physical sensation. By tying the diamond knot onto a barrel, the contents were no longer just a mystery grain. They became a known quantity, something that held the essence of its own requirements within its very label. The process of tying these knots became a rhythmic, meditative activity. One would pull the fibers taut, fold and tuck, then pull again, the repetition creating a state of focused calm. The storehouse became a place where this specific sound, the rustle of straw, the soft click of the crossing stalks, became the dominant tone, replacing the previous sense of disquiet with a new, structured harmony. As the diamonds were completed and placed into small, orderly piles, they glowed under the lantern light with a soft honey-gold radiance. Each one was a testament to the skill and the intent of the weaver. Looking at them, the farmers no longer felt the weight of their own ignorance. They felt empowered, equipped with a language that belonged to the earth and to their own hands. The diamond knot was a promise that the field would receive the exact seed it needed, that the cycles of the seasons would be respected, and that the spectre of the barren field was being systematically dismantled, one tightly woven, sun-hardened knot at a time. In deliberate contrast to the structural rigidity of the diamond knot, the marker for the moisture-loving grains required a different philosophy of movement. This was the long, loose weave, a design that favored fluidity, length, and a sense of open grace. To create these markers, the weavers selected the most supple, longest stalks from the harvest, those that had been allowed to ripen just until they reached a state of deep, golden maturity, retaining a hint of their inherent flexibility. Unlike the dense, compact knots of the wheat, these markers were fashioned to breathe, mirroring the behavior of the grains that thrived in the cool, damp embrace of the valley floor. The process began by taking several long stalks and joining them together with a light, airy twist. There was no need for the intense, biting tension of the diamond. Instead, the fingers moved with a gentle, flowing motion, allowing the straw to form long, sweeping loops. As the weaver progressed, they would allow the stalks to twist naturally around one another, creating a shape that looked like a tapered ribbon, soft to the touch and yielding in the hand. It was a form that felt light, almost ephemeral, yet held together by the gentle interlocking pressure of the weave. When one ran their fingers along the length of this marker, the sensation was one of smoothness and continuity. There were no sharp corners, no hard resistant centers. It felt like a strand of dried grass that had been kissed by a soft breeze, retaining a sense of openness that allowed one to feel the individual texture of every stalk within the braid. For the farmer, this was a sensory indicator of room to grow. It signified the varieties of barley and softer cereals that demanded a rich, heavy soil and were not afraid of the deep, slow-moving moisture of the landscape. To hold this marker was to feel the opposite of the diamond. It was a tactile invitation to sow in the areas where the land was soft, dark, and full of life. The creation of these markers became a soothing, rhythmic exercise. There was a gentle, whispering sound as the long stalks moved against one another, a soft, dry swish that was entirely different from the sharp clicks of the diamond weave. It was a sound that seemed to suggest the rustling of grain fields under a summer wind. The workers found that their movements became slower and more intentional, their breathing deepening to match the fluid pace of the braiding. It was a practice that brought a profound sense of ease to the storehouse, effectively washing away the remnants of the earlier, stressful atmosphere. These markers, once finished, were long, slender, and elegant. They were designed to hang with a graceful weight, swaying gently if they were brushed by a passing hand. When grouped together in a basket, they looked like a collection of golden sun-drenched feathers. The farmers, who had once stood in the storehouse feeling overwhelmed by the anonymous, jumbled contents of the barrels, now looked upon these markers with a sense of relief and quiet confidence. They could distinguish the markers even in the darkest corners of the barn, simply by the way they felt beneath their palms. This was the genius of the system. It translated the complex needs of the crops into a language of touch, a simple, intuitive, and deeply effective way to bring order back to their world. Every long, loose braid was a silent, tangible assurance that the rhythm of the fields was being restored, one graceful, hand-woven loop at a time. The transition from the initial concept sketched in the flickering lantern light to the physical reality of the workshop was marked by a shift in the very atmosphere of the granary. What had once been a space defined by silent, anxious waiting now hummed with the steady, purposeful energy of organized labor. Long wooden tables fashioned from sturdy, unfinished planks had been arranged in the center of the floor, creating a dedicated space where the transformation of the straw could occur. The air, once heavy with the dusty scent of neglect, now carried the sharp, clean perfume of freshly manipulated fibers, a fragrance reminiscent of a late summer meadow, warm and dry. The rhythm of the work became the heartbeat of the community. It was a repetitive, hypnotic cadence that seemed to slow the passage of time, pulling the workers into a state of deep, collective focus. The sound of the workshop was distinctive, a layered tapestry of subtle textures. There was the constant, soft rustle of dry straw being sorted and pulled from larger bundles, a sound like the gentle brushing of silk against wood. Over this lay the rhythmic clicking of stalks being folded, tucked and braided, a series of dry, percussive notes that resonated within the open rafters of the high ceiling. Every individual had found their place in this assembly. Some were tasked with the initial sorting, their hands moving with a practiced grace as they selected the most uniform stalks, setting aside any that were too brittle or frayed. Others, the more experienced weavers, focused on the construction of the intricate knots and the long, sweeping braids. There was very little conversation. The work itself demanded an intimate, tactile concentration. If someone needed to communicate, they did so with a simple gesture or a nod, a silent language that reinforced the sense of shared purpose. This was the physical manifestation of the system the Queen had envisioned. The transition from abstract planning to concrete reality was a process of grounding, a way to anchor their collective effort in the tangible, tactile world. As the afternoon light shifted, pouring through the high, narrow windows in golden, dust-filled shafts, the labourers could see the progress of their work. piles of finished markers grew steadily, the sharp geometric diamonds clustered together like a field of miniature golden flowers, and the long, flowing braids gathered in bundles that seemed to shimmer as they moved. The feeling of the work was profoundly soothing. The straw, once dampened to ensure flexibility, felt cool and smooth against the skin, a refreshing contrast to the warmth of the workshop. To hold a finished marker was to feel the weight of an intention, a small physical piece of clarity that had been carved out of the chaotic landscape of their recent past. This was not the work of bureaucracy. It was the work of artisans, a craft that honoured the materials and the land from which they had been born. The rhythm of the braiding, the over, the under, the pull, and the set became a meditative loop. For the farmers who had spent so many nights lying awake in their homes, haunted by the spectre of uncertainty, this activity was a balm. They were no longer passive victims of an unpredictable season. They were active participants in the restoration of order. Each braided stalk was a small defiant act against the chaos, a commitment to the discipline of the harvest. The storehouse had been transformed into a sanctuary of methodical, peaceful creation, where the only thing that mattered was the precision of the next stitch and the quiet, steady progression of the work toward a future that at last felt within their control. The act of teaching the system was an exercise in patience and quiet connection. Queen Fastrada moved among the labourers, not as a sovereign issuing decrees, but as a mentor sharing a craft. She would stand beside a farmer whose hands were broad and calloused from the plough, his fingers hesitant as he held the stiff stalks of rye. With a gentle, encouraging touch, she would show him how to soften the fibres with a light, damp cloth, explaining the need for the straw to yield without snapping. Her voice was low and calm, blending seamlessly into the soft ambient sounds of the workspace. There was a profound grace in the way she demonstrated the sequence of the knots. She would take a bundle of stalks and slowly, deliberately, show the path each one needed to take. She did not rush. She understood that this was not merely about learning a shape, but about learning to feel the potential of the material. When a student struggled, she would not reach out to take the work from them. Instead, she would guide their hands, letting them feel the necessary tension under their own skin. It was a tactile exchange, a slow transfer of knowledge that relied entirely on the shared experience of the senses. The labourers were attentive, their eyes fixed on the movement of the Queen's hands. They began to replicate the motions themselves, their initially awkward gestures becoming more fluid as they repeated the patterns. One could see the exact moment when the understanding took root. A subtle shift in the expression of their faces, a loosening of the shoulders, and the transition from tentative effort to confident, rhythmic production. They began to find their own style within the structure, discovering the subtle differences in texture that appeared based on how they tightened a knot or smoothed a braid. This period of teaching was a vital bridge in the social fabric of the estate. It broke down the barriers of status, leaving only the common human pursuit of solving a problem that affected them all equally. The Queen's presence was a steadying influence, a quiet anchor in the midst of their transformation. She would often pause to admire a particularly well-crafted marker, her approval expressed not in words but in a nod or a brief, satisfied smile. It was enough to encourage the workers to refine their technique even further. The atmosphere in the storehouse during these hours was one of deep, respectful focus. There was no sense of hierarchy, only the shared, methodical pursuit of order. The farmers learned that the language was as much about the intent they brought to the task as it was about the actual shape they produced. They were learning to read the needs of the earth through their hands, and in turn, they were learning that their own labour was the essential tool for meeting those needs. As the hours passed, the piles of finished straw markers grew, and with them the growing sense of community and collective capability. It was a patient, quiet revolution, where the most important lessons were not spoken, but woven into the very fabric of the straw, piece by piece, under the watchful, appreciative eyes of the Queen. The moment of testing the first completed labels against the reality of the grain was a quiet milestone. Fostrada walked to a barrel that had been previously identified as holding a mix of hardy, sun-resilient wheat. She selected one of the newly finished diamond-shaped straw markers. The contrast was immediate and striking. The straw was cool, polished by the warmth of the human palms that had crafted it, and possessed a supple, golden sheen. In contrast, when she dipped her hand into the barrel, the grain felt dry, grit-laden and irregular, the rough, dusty husks of the wheat pressing against her skin with a slightly abrasive, earthy texture. This sensory juxtaposition was the essence of the new system. The straw marker was a refined, elevated version of the nature it represented. It felt like the result of a deliberate human refinement, an object that had been brought from the chaotic state of raw matter into the orderly state of a signifier. When the queen tied the woven diamond onto the iron hoop of the barrel, the effect was visually and tactilely grounding. The knot rested against the cold, dark, oxidized metal, its golden color catching the dim light of the storehouse. Farmers gathered around to witness this simple act. They reached out to touch the marker, running their calloused fingertips over the sharp, defined edges of the diamond, and then dipping their hands back into the grain. The contrast was a revelation. The straw marker felt like the answer, and the grain felt like the question. For the first time in many seasons, the storehouse did not feel like a place of confusion. It felt like a library where the contents could be understood without the need for a single written word. The roughness of the grain no longer seemed overwhelming because it was now indexed by the smooth, intentional precision of the straw. They repeated this act for the other barrels, applying the long, flowing braids to the containers holding the moisture-loving barley. The sensation of the braid, long, soft and yielding, felt perfectly balanced against the cool, rounded kernels of the barley. It was as if the label had been grown from the grain itself, a natural extension of the plant's own characteristics. When a farmer touched the braid, they were instantly transported to the thought of the low-lying damp soil where such grain belonged. The disconnect that had plagued them, the uncertainty of where to plant and what to expect, began to vanish. The storehouse, once a source of anxiety, was becoming a space of calm, tactile information. The air felt lighter, less thick with the dust of agitation, and more filled with the crisp, clean scent of the organized harvest. Each time a new label was tied into place, it was as if a small, heavy burden had been lifted from the shoulders of the community. They were building a world of order, and they were doing it with the very material they used to feed themselves. The contrast between the rough, humble grain and the elegant, handcrafted straw marker was a profound reminder of the power of human intention. It was a simple, beautiful synergy, proving that even in the face of nature's unpredictable cycles, the human touch, when applied with patience and purpose, could impose a lasting, restorative harmony. With the system of identification firmly established, the atmosphere within the storehouse underwent a final, transformative shift. The phase of experimentation had passed, and the phase of deliberate, methodical implementation began. This was not a task to be rushed. It required the same heavy, rhythmic labor that had always defined the life of the farmer, but now it was infused with a new directional clarity. The heavy wooden barrels, once the silent containers of doubt, were now to be systematically emptied, inspected, and refilled, turning the entire granary into a vessel of purposeful potential. The process of moving the grain was a physical dialogue with the harvest. Two men would lift a heavy barrel, its iron-banded frame straining as they pivoted it toward the center of the floor. With a slow, controlled tilt, they would pour the contents out onto large, clean tarps spread across the earth. The sound was a cascading rhythmic roar, thousands of tiny, hard kernels tumbling over one another, a dry, golden waterfall that filled the air with a fine, powdery haze. As the grain settled, the smell was rich and concentrated, a pungent reminder of the summer heat and the earth's own resilience. Now, instead of merely shoveling the grain back into whatever container was nearest, the team followed the guidance of the Queen's straw labels. They inspected the mixture, their hands sifting through the kernels, sorting the wheat from the barley, the rye from the chaff. It was labor that demanded a quiet, meditative pace. They worked in pairs, one person scooping the grain, the other carefully monitoring the quality and ensuring that only the correct variety was directed into the barrel designated for it. As a barrel began to fill, one could hear the pitch of the pouring grain change. It moved from a sharp, frantic clatter to a deeper, more resonant thrum as the vessel reached its capacity. Each barrel was filled to a consistent height, leaving enough room for the air to circulate, a practice that respected the long-term needs of the seeds. When a barrel was full, it was sealed with a heavy wooden lid, and the appropriate straw marker, the diamond knot or the flowing braid, was tied securely to the iron hoop. The weight of the filled barrels was a tangible comfort. It was the weight of security, the accumulated effort of the previous year being locked into a safe, identified and orderly state. The farmers felt this weight in their own muscles, a satisfying ache that spoke of real, concrete progress. They were no longer simply storing grain. They were banking their future, setting aside the ingredients of the coming spring in a manner that was transparent and understood. Throughout this process, the silence of the storehouse was punctuated by the rhythmic scraping of shovels, the soft shuffling of feet, and the occasional satisfied grunt of exertion. The chaos that had once characterized these walls had been entirely purged. In its place stood rows of containers, each distinct, each labeled, each representing a specific path to the harvest. The visual order was serene, rows of dark, seasoned wood, each adorned with a golden woven tag that shimmered like a beacon in the dim light. The sense of accomplishment was palpable. It was as if the very air of the room had been cleared, leaving behind only the scent of dry, healthy grain and the promise of a season that, for the first time in many years, felt like a predictable, manageable journey. They had successfully contained the unpredictability of the natural world, binding it within the secure wooden walls of their own design, ready for the cycle to begin anew. The auditory landscape of the grain storehouse had become a symphony of order, a collection of sounds that served to anchor the mind in the present moment. Gone was the dissonant, hurried clatter of the past, replaced by a rhythmic, consistent cadence that resonated within the high, timbered rafters. Every action, every movement of the workers was now choreographed to a slow and steady beat. The most prominent sound was the pouring of the grain, a dry, cascading stream that fell from the wooden scoops into the deep, echoing depths of the barrels. It was a sound like the gentle murmur of a distant mountain brook, smooth and continuous, as thousands of individual kernels settled against one another in a precise layered formation. Layered beneath the pouring of the grain was the soft, papery crinkle of the dried straw stalks. As the farmers moved about the barn, their hands often brushed against the bundles of prepared markers, releasing a sound like the rustling of dried leaves in the deep, undisturbed quiet of an autumn forest. This was a fragile, high-pitched noise, a stark contrast to the deeper, resonant thrum of the grain. It was the sound of the system itself, the gentle, dry friction of the labels that identified the bounty within. Every time a marker was moved or tied, it emitted this soft, delicate sound, a reminder that the entire organization of the storehouse rested on these small, unassuming woven shapes. The workers themselves moved with a deliberate, hushed economy of motion. Their leather boots made a rhythmic, muffled thud against the packed, cool earth of the floor, a soft pulse that governed the pace of the day. There were no shouts, no rushed exchanges of panic. Instead, the air was filled with the sounds of focused artisanal labor, the occasional rhythmic scraping of a wooden shovel against the floor, the soft, metallic clink of an iron hoop as a barrel was shifted, and the faint, airy sigh of a door being gently pulled shut against the breeze. If you find solace in these historical accounts of human patience and the pursuit of peaceful order, we invite you to subscribe, like, and share. Your presence here helps us continue to weave these stories of time and tradition, fostering a space of calm for all who listen. It was a world of sound that demanded total presence. One could not listen to the storehouse and remain in a state of distraction. The rhythm of the grain and the rustle of the straw pulled the listener into the core of the work, creating a cocoon of sound that felt both ancient and reassuring. This auditory environment was a sensory representation of the safety they were building. By simply existing within this acoustic space, the farmers felt the tension of the previous disorganized years dissolving, replaced by the deep, resonant certainty of a task being done well. The sounds of the storehouse were the sounds of a community reclaiming its future, one pour, one rustle, and one measured breath at a time, until the room itself seemed to hum with the quiet, steady vibration of a harvest that was finally unequivocally secure. The shift in the atmosphere within the storehouse was not sudden, yet it was profound, a slow atmospheric transition from the high-pitched vibration of panic to the low, steady resonance of grounded purpose. In the months that preceded the Queen's arrival, the air had felt thin and frantic, charged with the nervous energy of people who felt they were losing their grasp on the future. Every task had been performed with a sense of urgency, as if they were racing against an invisible, encroaching shadow. But as the system of straw-woven labels took hold, the air seemed to thicken, not with dust, but with a settled, heavy stability. It was as though the very oxygen in the granary had been replaced by a sense of calm. The farmers, moving through the rows of labelled barrels, found that their movements had lost the jagged edges of anxiety. They no longer paused to look over their shoulders or consult one another in hushed, worried tones. Instead, their labour flowed with the easy, natural grace of a stream following its bed. The transition was one of internal posture. They were no longer standing in a defensive crouch against the prospect of famine, but rather stood with the open, steady posture of those who had done their duty and were prepared for what would come. This grounded purpose manifested in the way they maintained the space. They began to treat the storehouse with a new level of care. The floor was swept clean of debris, not in a frantic scramble to finish the task, but with a methodical, sweeping rhythm that left the packed earth smooth and dust-free. The tools were cleaned and returned to their places, not tossed into the corners, but placed with intention. The light, entering through the high, timbered gaps, seemed to illuminate a place that was not merely a barn for grain, but a temple of disciplined survival. For the Queen, observing this change was a source of quiet, reflective satisfaction. She saw that the true success of her initiative was not merely the organization of the seeds, but the reclamation of the people's peace of mind. By providing them with a way to order their world, she had given them back their sense of agency. The panic had been a byproduct of feeling powerless, of being unable to read the signs of their own sustenance. With the straw tags in their hands, they were no longer subjects of a chaotic climate, but active, intelligent stewards of their own destiny. The silence that now filled the granary was no longer an empty, expectant silence, but one that was filled with the hum of a job well done. It was a comfortable, solid quiet that allowed one to think, to breathe, and to exist without the constant gnawing itch of worry. The farmers would sometimes stand for a moment before leaving, just to look at the rows of barrels, a scene of quiet, monochromatic beauty. The dark, aged wood, the golden straw labels, and the cool, earthy smell of the grain combined to create a landscape of total serenity. They had transitioned from a state of reactive fear to a state of proactive, grounded strength. The ground beneath their feet felt firmer, the future felt more predictable, and the simple act of existing in their own workspace had become a source of profound restorative rest. While the interior of the storehouse had become a sanctuary of organized stillness, the world outside was undergoing its own gradual, magnificent transformation. The late winter season was yielding ever so slowly to the first tentative breaths of spring. To step from the cool, shaded interior of the granary into the open air was to step into a landscape that was subtly yet unmistakably shifting its mood. The sky, which had been a harsh iron grey for much of the winter, was beginning to soften into a pale, translucent blue reminiscent of a polished stone. The light had changed in quality. It was no longer the sharp, aggressive brilliance of the winter sun, which seemed only to emphasize the cold, but a softer, more pervasive luminescence that seemed to glow from within the clouds themselves. Across the fields the earth was waking. The frost that had held the soil in a hard, unyielding grip was receding, leaving behind a damp, dark surface that smelled of rot and resurrection. It was the scent of the cycle turning, the breakdown of the old to make way for the new. On the slopes of the hills, the first shy shoots of green were appearing, small points of vibrant life pushing through the layer of dead, brown grasses. The trees in the distant copses still stood skeletal and bare against the horizon, their branches black and intricate, but there was a subtle swelling in the buds, a quiet, internal pressure as the sap began its slow upward climb. The wind, once biting and raw, now carried a different note, a faint sweet humidity that hinted at the distant warmer lands from which it travelled. Standing near the storehouse wall, one could feel the transition in the very texture of the air. It was a time of immense, quiet labour in nature, an effort that was just as methodical and patient as the labour that had taken place inside the barn. The earth was preparing its own storage, readying itself to receive the seeds that were now so carefully marked and tucked away in their barrels. The birds were beginning to return, their calls soft and infrequent at first, a series of melodic questioning notes that drifted across the stillness of the valley. There was a profound harmony between the work of the farmers and the work of the season. By organizing the grain, the people had synchronized themselves with the rhythm of the planet. They were no longer at odds with the changing weather, they were waiting for it, prepared and ready to act the moment the soil reached its perfect, yielding consistency. This realization brought a sense of serenity that was difficult to describe. It was the feeling of being in alignment with a larger, more ancient mechanism. The observation of these seasonal shifts was a practice in humility. The farmers knew that for all their straw knots and carefully filled barrels, they were ultimately guests of the landscape. They watched the changing light, felt the softening of the wind, and listened for the first true song of the return of warmth. It was a meditative vigil. Outside the storehouse walls, the world was shifting, unfolding, and preparing for the surge of growth, while inside, the community stood in a state of prepared, patient readiness, bound together by the knowledge that they had done what was necessary, and that the coming spring would find them anchored, firm, fully in control of their own survival. As the weeks advanced and the memory of the winter's confusion began to recede, a subtle change took hold within the community. The farmers who had once approached the granary with a hesitant, almost fearful curiosity now moved with a new sense of quiet confidence. The trust they had begun to place in the straw-woven language was absolute, rooted in the visceral, undeniable reality of their own touch. When a labourer entered the cool, dim space of the storehouse, their hand would naturally drift toward the barrels, their fingers brushing against the familiar, structured shapes of the markers. The relief this brought was profound. It was not a sudden explosion of joy, but a steady, deepening sense of inner peace. To know exactly what lay within a container, to feel the sharp, defensive geometry of the diamond knot, and know, without question, that the drought-resistant wheat was waiting inside, was a psychological balm. It effectively quieted the intrusive thoughts that had once kept them awake in the long, dark hours. The burden of guessing, the agonizing mental labor of trying to recall or deduce the identity of the grain, had been lifted. The tactile language acted as a constant, silent reassurance. Even when the storehouse was plunged into near-total darkness, a farmer could navigate the space with complete certainty. They would run their hands along the iron hoops and wooden staves, feeling for the familiar, comforting textures of the straw. They knew that the language would not betray them. It was consistent, reliable, and deeply honest. There was no ambiguity in a knot or a braid, no room for the doubt that had characterized the messy, jumbled barrels of the previous years. This trust extended to the social fabric of the village as well. Because the system was so intuitive and so easily communicated, there was no longer a need for a centralized, complex authority to manage the distribution. The farmers could teach one another, passing the knowledge of the knots down to their children or across to their neighbors. The information was democratic, belonging to anyone who had the patience to learn the weave. This shared, common knowledge created a new sense of unity, a collective reliance on a system that they had all helped to implement. The feeling of relief was so pervasive that it seemed to change the very way the community carried itself. The tension that had tightened their shoulders and narrowed their eyes during the lean months had dissipated, replaced by a more open, relaxed demeanor. They spoke of the upcoming planting with a practical, calm anticipation. They discussed the weather not as a looming threat, but as a condition to be observed and managed. This was the true gift of the Queen's initiative, the restoration of their mental landscape. By creating a physical, tactile manifestation of order, she had allowed the farmers to put down their mental burdens. They could sleep without the phantom of hunger, and they could walk to the fields in the morning with a clear, focused intention. The straw tags were more than just labels. They were the symbols of a community that had found its way back to a state of balance, trust, and profound, enduring security. The winter months settled over the landscape like a thick, insulating blanket, turning the world into a realm of muted sounds and grey horizons. In the village, this was a time of internal, rhythmic quiet, a season where the focus of the community moved from the sprawling expanse of the fields to the concentrated, repetitive labour within the walls of their homes and the central storehouse. It was a period of deepening discipline, a slow-paced meditation that helped the people internalize the lessons of the autumn harvest and the organization of the grain. Day after day, the farmers returned to the workshop, their movements now ingrained with the habit of order. The work was simple and unhurried. They would spend hours cleaning, inspecting, and reweaving the straw, ensuring that every marker was perfectly taut, every knot secured, and every braid long and graceful. It was a quiet, steady exercise in mindfulness. There was a unique, grounding satisfaction in the repetition, the deliberate folding of the stalks, the gentle pull of the fibers, the soft, rhythmic clicking of the straw as it took form. This work fostered a sense of shared purpose that transcended the simple necessity of survival. As they labored together, a silent, mutual understanding grew among them. They were not merely laborers. They were the guardians of a system that had saved them from the brink of chaos. This shared identity created a subtle, pervasive bond that made the long, cold days pass with an unexpected grace. They would work for hours in a state of flow, their attention entirely occupied by the texture of the straw and the precision of the weave, occasionally interrupted only by the sound of a distant winter bird or the soft crackle of the wood in the community hearth. The discipline was not something that was imposed from above. It was something that they had cultivated from within. They had learned that the care they took with the straw was the same care they would take with the soil. Every knot that was tied with precision was a testament to the fact that they were no longer willing to leave their future to chance. This internalized standard, a quiet, uncompromising commitment to detail, began to infuse every aspect of their lives. From the way they stored their own modest hearthwood to the way they repaired their tools, there was a new, observable intentionality. The community had found a form of peace in this rigor. They discovered that when life is simplified, when one's primary tasks are made clear and the tools for achieving them are made legible, there is a profound reduction in the noise of the mind. The anxiety that had once clouded their perspective during the winter nights had entirely evaporated, replaced by a stable, predictable routine. They felt a sense of ownership over their existence, a quiet pride in the order they had created together. The winter, which had once been a time of dread, had become a period of cultivation, not just of their grain, but of their own collective character. They were becoming a people of deep, grounded patience, preparing for the spring not with the frantic energy of the desperate, but with the measured, steady confidence of the well-prepared. This was the silent, transformative power of their shared discipline, a quiet labour that was stitching together the fabric of a resilient and orderly future. The turning of the calendar towards spring was felt first in the air, a subtle shift that escaped the eyes but was immediately perceived by the spirit. While the frost still held the shadows of the valley in a crisp white grip, the mornings began to carry a different weight. The air was no longer biting but rather expectant. It held a faint, lingering chill, a reminder of the winter's long dominance, yet there was a lightness in the breeze, a suggestion of distant warmth that stirred the dormant energy of the earth. The sky, once a persistent leaden grey, now flirted with shades of pale lavender and soft, watery gold as the sun traced a higher, more determined arc across the horizon. Within the storehouse, this anticipation was mirrored in the behaviour of the people. The work had shifted from the long, restorative weaving of the winter to the final, methodical preparations for the sowing. Every barrel was checked once more, the iron hoops inspected, and the straw markers smoothed with a sense of reverent care. There was an electricity in the quiet, a sense that the stored potential of the grain was finally reaching its moment of release. The farmers would pause in their work, looking toward the high, narrow apertures of the barn where the light was growing longer and stronger, and they could feel the pressure of the season beginning to build. Outside, the landscape was in the early stages of its long-awaited thaw. The edges of the small streams that threaded through the fields were the first to break, the ice cracking with a sound like snapping glass, followed by the soft, steady gurgle of water once again finding its path over stone and mud. The earth, which had been as hard as iron for months, began to show the first faint signs of softening. In the most sheltered pockets, the soil had started to turn a deep, rich brown, holding the scent of damp moss and awakening roots. The anticipation was not a frantic, hurried state, but a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of one's feet. It was the feeling of a machine that had been perfectly maintained and was now ready to be set in motion. The farmers noticed the changes, the return of a different, more melodic song from the birds, the faint green mist that was beginning to settle over the hills, and the way the mud clung to their boots with a soft, persistent weight. These were the signals they had been waiting for, the ancient reliable cues that the time for reflection was ending and the time for action had arrived. This waiting was a form of active meditation. It required them to be perfectly synchronized with the land, watching for the moment when the soil reached the precise consistency required for the plough. They stood on the threshold between the period of storage and the period of growth, feeling the transition within themselves. There was no longer any doubt, no longer any fear of the coming months. They were anchored in their readiness, their barrels full and correctly identified, their hearts calm, and their minds focused on the singular, beautiful promise of the upcoming cycle. They were at peace, poised at the very edge of the world's renewal, listening to the soft, rhythmic heartbeat of the spring as it slowly, deliberately began to pulse through the valley once more. The final days before the sowing were marked by a meticulous, reverent ritual of checking and rechecking the storehouse. This was not the work of uncertainty, but the final polish on a masterpiece of organization. The farmers moved through the rows of barrels with a familiar, easy grace, their hands instinctively reaching for the straw markers before their eyes even processed the labels. Each barrel was opened, the lid lifted with a soft sliding scrape to allow for one last inspection of the grain within. The air was filled with the faint, nutty perfume of the seeds, a scent that had become the smell of security itself. They performed the physical acts of verification with a quiet, solemn focus. A hand would descend into the grain, feeling for any trace of dampness or any sign of the unwanted moisture that had once been the bane of their existence. Finding none, they would nod, a simple gesture of collective agreement, and replace the lid. They then turned their attention to the labels themselves, untying and retying the straw knots and braids to ensure they were secure, clean, and perfectly placed upon the iron hoops. The diamond knots, crisp and sharp, sat proudly in their designated sections, while the long, flowing braids hung with a gentle, inviting elegance. This final sorting was a time of reflection. As they handled the grain and the markers, the farmers couldn't help but look back at the journey they had taken together, from the desperate, confused days of the previous season to this current state of structured, calm readiness. The contrast was stark, yet it filled them with a profound sense of gratitude. They were no longer just labourers, they were masters of their own survival. They had learned that the most complex problems could often be solved with the simplest tools, provided those tools were used with patience, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to the natural order. The sound of this work was almost musical, the soft, percussive clatter of the wooden lids being set back into place, the rhythmic rustle of the straw as it was smoothed by hand, and the low, steady breathing of the workers. There was a sense of profound rightness to every motion. The storehouse had been brought to a state of total, serene readiness. Nothing was misplaced, nothing was forgotten, and every variety of seed was perfectly aligned with the soil it was destined to meet. As they stepped back to view the final orderly rows, they felt a deep, resonant hum of achievement. The granary was not just full, it was coherent. It was a space that spoke of human agency and the beauty of disciplined, intentional labor. They knew that when the morning came to begin the sowing, they would walk out of these doors with complete clarity, their sacks filled with the right seed, their minds free of the fog of apprehension. The act of sorting had become a final grounding anchor, a way to collect their intentions and solidify their purpose before the great kinetic release of the spring planting. In the quiet, dusty light of the storehouse, they stood in silence for a long moment, honoring the peace they had created, before turning to walk out into the fresh, awakening air of the valley, their hearts as steady and as ready as the rows of grain they had left behind. The departure from the storehouse on the morning of the first sowing was a moment of quiet, ritualistic transition. The air outside was cool and still, the valley draped in a thin, translucent mist that caught the first pale rays of the sunrise. As each farmer stepped across the threshold, they paused for a brief, intentional second. Their hands, calloused and strong, reached out one final time to brush against the straw tags hanging from the barrels. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a tactile connection between the human hand and the woven fibre that had bridged the gap between their doubt and their current, unshakable resolve. The feeling of the straw against the skin was comforting and familiar. There was a sense of gratitude in the touch, a silent thank you to the small, humble markers that had turned their world of confusion into a map of order. As they grasped their heavy, woven sacks, the bags that would carry the grain to the fields, the weight felt different than it had in the past. It was no longer a weight of burden or anxiety. It was the weight of potential. They knew exactly what they were carrying, and they knew exactly where it needed to go. The grain inside the sacks was no longer a mystery. It was a known entity, bound to the specific needs of the earth that awaited it. Walking out into the soft, waking light of the morning, they moved with a steady, purposeful gait. The village was silent save for the awakening sounds of the countryside, the faint, distant song of a lark ascending into the clouds, the soft rustle of the wind beginning to stir the trees, and the rhythmic, crunching sound of their own footsteps on the path. There was a profound, quiet beauty in this movement. They were not heading out in a rush. They were walking with the calm, measured stride of those who have already completed the most difficult part of the journey. The connection between the farmer's hand and the straw tag had been the catalyst for this piece. By simplifying the information, the Queen had made the entire labour of the season accessible, intuitive, and deeply personal. Every time a farmer looked down at his hand, he saw the callouses, the dirt of the soil, and the enduring strength of his own skin, and he was reminded that he was the bridge between the seed and the harvest. The straw tags were merely the tools, but the hand that touched them was the true agent of change. As they reached the edge of the first field, the dew lay heavy and silver on the grass, a sparkling, pristine carpet that reflected the soft colours of the dawn. The earth beneath their feet was soft, yielding and rich with the scent of potential. There was no need for maps or complex directions. Their intuition, guided by the memory of the straw markers, dictated the path. They knew which fields were for the deep-rooted wheat and which were for the moisture-loving barley. The landscape seemed to open up before them, welcoming and legible. It was a day of profound clarity, where the connection between the person, the tool, and the land was as seamless and natural as the turning of the seasons themselves. They began the work not as people burdened by the past, but as stewards of a future they had meticulously and lovingly designed. The arrival of the sowing season brought with it a visual transformation of the landscape that was as subtle as it was profound. The fields, which had laid dormant and seemingly chaotic under the winter snows, were now canvases ready to be painted with the rhythmic lines of the plough. As the farmers opened their sacks, the grain within appeared not just as a harvest, but as a deliberate collection of purpose. When held in the palm of a hand, the seed seemed to catch the morning light with a distinct, categorized luster. The wheat, intended for the well-drained, higher elevations, gleamed with a warm amber tone, while the barley and rye reflected the softer, cooler light of the valley floor, their surfaces matte and sturdy. This was the visual beauty of the categorized harvest, a clarity that made the landscape appear purposeful. As the seeds were scattered, the movement was not a frantic, aimless broadcast, but a precise rhythmic dance. The farmers walked with a steady pace, their hands moving in wide, sweeping arcs that dropped the grain in perfectly measured intervals. Because they understood exactly which variety they were casting into the soil, every motion was imbued with a quiet, confident intent. There was no hesitation, no stopping to wonder if the wrong handful had been chosen. The link between the straw tag in the storehouse and the seed in the hand was unbroken, creating a sense of total harmonious alignment. From a distance, the act of sowing became a choreography of order. The farmers appeared as silhouettes against the soft pastel hues of the dawn, their figures tracing long flowing lines across the dark earth. The fields, once perceived as a collection of unpredictable patches, now looked like a system waiting to be activated. The visual impact of the prepared, categorized grain was a source of great comfort to those who watched from the village margins. They could see the patterns forming, the way the different shades of the grain began to populate the rows, creating a natural gradient of color that would soon grow into the distinct, healthy patches of the harvest. The beauty of this scene lay in its utter lack of pretension. It was a purely functional beauty, born from the fact that everything was exactly where it was meant to be. There was a sense of profound rightness in seeing the dark, rich loam being populated by the very seeds that were best suited to thrive there. It was a landscape that was finally reading correctly. The chaotic, hodgepodge fields of the previous years had been replaced by a vision of disciplined potential, where the promise of the coming season was written in the very geography of the planting. To walk through these fields was to experience a meditative stillness. The scent of the freshly turned earth, cool and damp, mixed with the faint, sweet and nutty perfume of the grain as it was released into the air. It was a sensory environment that spoke of deep, grounded stability. The farmers, who had spent so many nights lost in the anxiety of the unknown, now stood in the center of a world that they had made understandable and manageable. Every step they took was a commitment to this order, and every seed they cast was a small, silent contribution to a harvest that would at last be abundant and secure. The visual beauty of the categorized grain was the first sign of a season that would finally allow the community to flourish, a testament to the fact that when the foundation is clear, the work itself becomes a form of art. The act of planting was a symphony of precision, a deliberate mapping of the earth's own character against the intrinsic needs of the seed. Each field was not merely a plot of land, but a unique entity with its own personality. Some areas drained quickly, their soil light and eager to drink in the warmth, while others held the deep, slow-moving moisture of the valley bottom. For the farmers, this understanding had always existed in the background of their minds. But the system of straw tags had finally allowed them to act upon it with absolute certainty. As they approached the rocky, well-draining slopes, they reached into the sacks labelled with the sharp, resilient diamond knots. They knew these kernels were the descendants of grains that had learned to survive in the face of the sun's most relentless glare, their roots capable of reaching deep into the cool, sheltered fractures of the stone to find what little life was hidden there. Casting this wheat was an act of confidence. The grain hit the soil with a soft, settling sound, disappearing into the cracks of the freshly turned furrows, waiting for the moment when it would draw its strength from the very rock that had seemed so inhospitable to others. Moving downward toward the heavier, loam-rich basins, the gait of the planters changed to match the transition of the earth. Here the soil felt different underfoot, denser, softer, and filled with the rich, dark potential of the lowlands. They turned to the sacks marked with the flowing, graceful braids. These seeds were the travelers of the valley, grain that thrived in the cool, steady dampness, craving the nutrients that collected where the water naturally pooled. Watching the seed leave the hand and disappear into this rich, dark cradle was like witnessing a promise being fulfilled. There was no doubt that the moisture-loving barley would find its home here, expanding and rooting with a vigor that the sun-hardened wheat would never possess. This process of mapping was inherently meditative. The farmers found themselves in a state of deep, quiet communion with the landscape. They were no longer simply casting grain, they were engaging in an act of reconciliation, placing every variety where it was destined to grow. It was a rhythmic, repetitive motion that demanded total focus. Every arc of the arm, every step along the furrow was an investment in the logic of the system. The connection between the tactile label in the storehouse and the biological reality of the field was seamless, a chain of causality that made the entire day feel effortless. There was a profound sense of satisfaction in this alignment. To see the landscape being populated in such a logical, orderly fashion was to see a reflection of the order they had created within themselves. They were no longer at the mercy of the wind or the whim of the rain. They were active, knowing participants in the growth of the valley. Each furrow was a line of dialogue, and each seed was a word in a sentence of abundance. The act of planting became an expression of trust, trust in the land, trust in the seed, and most importantly, trust in the system they had built with their own hands. As the sun climbed higher, warming their shoulders and glinting off the dew, the fields took on a new, purposeful appearance. The chaos of the previous seasons had been completely overwritten by this map of intent, leaving behind a vision of a future that felt as solid and reliable as the earth itself. The progression of the spring days was a slow, luminous unfolding, a period where the world seemed to expand in every direction. With each passing sunrise, the light lingered a few moments longer, casting a golden, honeyed glow across the landscape that deepened in intensity as the afternoon drew to a close. This lengthening light brought with it a shift in the temperature. The air, once marked by the lingering sharp edge of the frost, now held the soft, humid warmth of a world in full rejuvenation. The fields were no longer empty, dark expanses, but active sites of subterranean transformation, where the carefully mapped seeds began their slow, quiet climb toward the surface. In the center of this burgeoning activity, the rhythmic motion of the plough became the heartbeat of the valley. It was a slow, steady, and hypnotic pace that governed the movement of the day. One could hear the sound of it from far away, the deep, guttural rip of the iron blade as it cleaved the earth, followed by the soft, satisfying crumble of the soil as it turned over in a long, dark ribbon. The oxen, their muscles moving with a slow, heavy grace, pulled in perfect tandem with the driver, their breath visible in the morning air like small, ephemeral clouds. This activity was a study in meditative patience. The driver, walking alongside the plough, moved with a stride that was perfectly synchronized to the rhythm of the blade. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. The lines they created were straight, true, and enduring, marking the fields with a series of clean, orderly rows that stretched from one end of the valley to the other. To watch this process was to observe the imposition of human intention onto the raw, wild beauty of the landscape, a partnership that felt ancient and entirely necessary. The scent of the work was primal and restorative. As the plough turned the earth, it released the deep, mineral perfume of the soil, a smell that was layered with the rich, damp aroma of the sublayers, the faint, sweet scent of sprouting roots, and the crisp, clean freshness of the open air. It was a smell that seemed to fill the lungs and clear the mind, a sensory reminder of the cycle of life that was currently in motion. The farmers found themselves deeply absorbed by the work, their thoughts settling into the same steady rhythm as the oxen's tread and the plough's progress. This season of lengthening light was a time of internal expansion. As the days grew, so did the farmers' sense of place. They were not merely working the land, they were witnessing it. They watched the hedgerows turn from brown to a soft haze-like green, observed the slow migration of the clouds, and listened to the increasing variety of the birdsongs as the season progressed. It was a world that felt both vast and intimately known. They were at the center of their own renewal, and the methodical, rhythmic labor was the foundation upon which that renewal rested. If these chronicles of historical ingenuity and the quiet rhythm of the seasons bring you a sense of inner peace and rest, we warmly invite you to subscribe, like, and share. Your continued support sustains this space, allowing us to curate further tales of human perseverance and the serene beauty of the past. The work was relentless yet entirely peaceful. It was the labor of the season, a foundational requirement for the abundance that would surely follow. In the golden glow of the late afternoon, as the shadows stretched out across the freshly turned furrows, the fields looked like a beautifully organized, expectant promise. They had done the work of the spring, and now they could simply allow the earth to do its own. The response of the earth was not a sudden burst of greenery, but a gradual, quiet emergence, a series of soft emerald punctuations appearing across the dark, turned soil. Day by day, the rows that the farmers had so meticulously prepared began to reveal their secrets. It was a sight that brought a sense of profound, silent validation to the entire community. Where the diamond-marked wheat had been cast, the shoots appeared firm, narrow, and upright, standing with a disciplined resilience against the unpredictable breezes that swept down from the high slopes. They looked like tiny green soldiers perfectly aligned, marking the path of the plough with unwavering precision. Down in the moisture-retaining basins, the response was equally distinct. The barley and the softer cereals, sown with the intent of the flowing braid labels, emerged with a broader, more succulent leaf, a vibrant, lush green that seemed to drink in the heavy morning dew. These shoots appeared more relaxed, their growth a testament to the abundance of the soil and the comfort of the sheltered valley. They fanned out with a gentle, graceful expansion, creating a soft, verdant carpet that felt as generous and welcoming as the markers that had once designated their home. To walk among these rows was to experience a profound sense of harmony. The visual chaos that had haunted the previous years was gone, replaced by a clear, logical architecture of growth. The discipline of the planting was now reflected in the discipline of the emergence. Because the seed had been placed in its ideal environment, the germination had been swift, uniform, and healthy. There were no stunted patches of struggling, misplaced crops, no patches of bare, unyielding earth where a seed had failed to find purchase. Instead, the fields were covered in an organized, healthy progression that seemed to follow a master design. This orderly growth was a constant sensory reinforcement of the peace the community had cultivated. The farmers would spend time in the fields during the quiet, golden hours of the morning, simply observing the way the light caught the first delicate dew on the tips of the shoots. They would look at the rows, tracing the straight lines with their eyes, and feel a deep, resonant calm. This was the harvest they had built, not the grain itself, which was yet months away, but the certainty that they were on the right path. The rows were a physical manifestation of their foresight, a living confirmation that the system they had implemented was working exactly as intended. The silence of the fields during these times was exquisite. It was a silence filled with the quiet, powerful energy of growth, a soundless, relentless push toward the sun. There was no anxiety in the fields, only the steady, patient progress of life itself. The farmers felt a connection to the earth that was deeper than it had ever been. They were no longer guessing, no longer struggling against the tide of the seasons. They had become partners with the land, their labor acting as the framing for the earth's own natural creativity. As they stood amidst the disciplined rows, watching the green leaves unfurl under the gentle, warming sun, they felt a sense of belonging that was absolute. The season was unfolding exactly as they had hoped, a testament to the quiet power of order, and they were finally truly at rest. Standing at the edge of the fields as the spring transitioned into the early warmth of summer, one could not help but reflect on the remarkable transformation of the landscape. In the years that had passed before the introduction of the Queen's straw language, the fields had been characterized by a confusing, erratic heterogeneity. They had been in every sense a hodgepodge, a patchwork of disparate, struggling stalks where drought-sensitive plants often found themselves stranded in the parched, high-altitude sun, while hardy, rugged grains were buried in the suffocating, waterlogged depths of the valley. That chaotic lack of organization had been a visible, aching wound upon the countryside, a constant reminder of the community's shared struggle and the inefficiency of their collective labor. Now, however, the eye was greeted by a landscape of profound, serene clarity. The efficiency of the new system was not merely a logistical success, it was a visual revelation. The fields were organized into harmonious, distinct zones where each plant stood in its proper element. There were no longer the ragged, stunted patches that had once signaled failure. nor the uneven heights of crops forced to compete with one another for the wrong nutrients. Instead, the fields were uniform, healthy, and thriving, displaying the strength and vitality of a population that had been given exactly what it required to succeed. This absence of the hodgepodge was more than just a matter of aesthetics. It was a triumph of human reason and artisanal care. The farmers, looking out over the undulating waves of green, felt a sense of relief that was almost physical. They had spent so many seasons apologizing to the land for their mistakes, watching as their wasted efforts vanished into the indifferent soil. Now they were in a state of reciprocal respect with the earth. They had held up their end of the bargain by learning to read the needs of the soil through the tactile language of the straw tags, and the earth, in return, had rewarded them with a display of unhindered, orderly growth. The efficiency of this system allowed the farmers a measure of time and peace they had never previously known. They no longer had to spend their days correcting the errors of the past or frantically trying to salvage failing, mismatched sections of their crops. The work was now proactive, consistent, and surprisingly light. They were freed from the constant, underlying hum of worry, and in that newfound space they found a quiet internal stability. They could appreciate the landscape for its own inherent beauty, observing the way the wind moved in long, sweeping ripples across the verdant grain, a sight that now brought a sense of pure, undistilled calm. This reflection was a quiet, meditative process. They realized that the chaos they had feared had never been a flaw in the land itself, but a consequence of their own disconnection from it. By bridging that gap with the simple, humble material of the harvest, they had reclaimed their role as intelligent, capable stewards. The field stood as a silent, beautiful testament to that restoration, a landscape that was finally and definitively in balance. Every row, every stalk, and every vibrant patch of colour was a piece of evidence that order had been restored, allowing them to witness the season's progress not with the eyes of those who fear, but with the eyes of those who have finally found their way home. As summer settled over the valley, the transformation of the fields reached its peak, a golden, shimmering culmination of the work begun in the quiet months of winter. The green, verdant shoots of the spring had matured, thickening into sturdy stalks that now bowed gently under the weight of ripening heads. It was a sight that felt like the realization of a long-held silent vow. Across the rolling landscape, the grain swayed in the breeze, a hypnotic, rhythmic dance of gold and amber that mirrored the flow of the wind itself. Looking out over this expanse, one could clearly see the distinction between the varieties, a testament to the spring's careful, intentional labor. In the higher sections, the wheat stood upright and proud, its bearded heads catching the sun and turning it into a brilliant, glowing fire. In the lower basins, the barley and rye formed a softer, deeper-toned carpet, their movement more fluid and rhythmic as they responded to the heavier, cooler air near the valley floor. It was a landscape that felt entirely coherent, a visual symphony where every part played its role with a quiet, unwavering strength. This was the visible reward for the months of meticulous sorting, the straw-woven tags, and the measured, steady pace of the ploughing. The chaos that had once defined their harvest had been replaced by this harmonious order. The farmers, standing at the edge of the fields, felt a profound, wordless sense of accomplishment. They remembered the feel of the dry, brittle straw between their fingers, the soft click of the knots, and the deliberate, meditative act of tying those markers onto the barrels. It all seemed a world away now, yet it was the bedrock upon which this golden bounty rested. The movement of the stalks was accompanied by a soft, dry rustling, a sound like the whispering of 1,000 silk threads brushing against one another. It was a peaceful, constant noise, a sound that seemed to soothe the very air of the valley. For those who had spent the previous years in a state of constant, gnawing anxiety, this sound was a balm. It was the music of a system that had worked, the sound of nature and human intent finally moving in synchronicity. The aesthetic beauty of the golden stalks was not merely a matter of light and colour, it was the beauty of security. To look at these fields was to know, with an absolute, grounded certainty, that the granary would be full, that the community would be fed, and that the cycle of the seasons had been respected. The farmers felt a weight lifting from their shoulders. The weight of uncertainty, the weight of the unknown, the weight of being small and powerless in the face of the shifting climate. They were no longer victims of their environment. They were its stewards. The golden fields stretched out before them, a testament to their patience and their discipline, shimmering in the heat of the summer day, as if to confirm that they had at last found their rhythm, their place and their lasting, hard-won peace. The air in the valley had grown heavy and golden, carrying the rich, toasted scent of grain that had reached its final maturity. As the stalks began to lose their moisture and transition from a pliable green to a brittle, sun-drenched amber, the community entered the final critical phase of the agricultural cycle. Preparing for the harvest was no longer a frantic endeavor defined by the fear of rot. It was a methodical, disciplined readying of resources that respected the botanical reality of the crop. The farmers understood that the harvest window was precise, wait too long, and the kernels would shatter and fall to the earth, harvest too early, and the grain would remain too moist to store safely in the barrels. The preparation was a collective ritualistic rhythm. The scythes were pulled from storage and meticulously peened, a process of cold hammering the metal edge to thin it, followed by careful honing with whetstones until the blade was keen enough to shear through the dry, fibrous stalks with minimal effort. This was an essential, technical task. A dull blade would cause the stalks to shatter or tear rather than fall cleanly, leading to wasted yield. The community worked in the cool, early morning light, ensuring each tool was balanced and sharp, ready for the relentless rhythmic motion of the reaping. In the village, the logistics were finalized with the same clarity that had characterized their winter organization. The threshing floors were cleared and swept, and the winnowing baskets were inspected for damage. Every member of the community moved with a calm, focused intent, aware that the harvest was the moment of truth for the system they had built. They gathered in the evenings not to fret, but to review the fields and assess the readiness of each variety, confirming that the wheat on the high slopes and the barley in the lowlands had reached the optimal moisture content for cutting. The barrels within the storehouse stood ready, their straw markers serving as a visual map for where the threshed grain would soon reside. To handle a straw marker now was to hold a symbol of their success. These simple woven tokens had successfully bridged the gap between a season of confusion and one of planned abundance. The farmers knew that the gathering of the grain was the final, critical link in the chain of causality they had established, a closing of the cycle that demanded the same level of care they had applied to the first planting. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long amber shadows across the fields, the community felt the gravity of the impending labor. The harvest would be demanding a final grueling push of physical endurance before the storage of the winter. Yet there was no anxiety. They stood together, looking out over the fields they had nurtured with such technical precision, fully present and entirely at peace. They were prepared to gather the bounty, knowing that each clean stroke of the scythe was a testament to their patience, their discipline, and their mastery over the rhythms of the land. They awaited the dawn, ready to bring the cycle to its natural, successful conclusion. The harvest began at the first light of dawn, a time when the dew still clung to the stalks, providing a fleeting, necessary moisture that helped keep the grain heads intact as the scythes moved through the fields. The sound was distinct and rhythmic, a sharp shearing hiss followed by the soft sweeping thud of the stalks falling in unison. The farmers worked in a synchronized line, their motions efficient and fluid. By keeping their blades low and their pace steady, they ensured that the cut was clean, minimizing the loss of grain that would have occurred with a jagged, uneven strike. This was the culmination of their technical discipline. Every movement was calculated to preserve the integrity of the yield. As the morning warmed, the dew evaporated, and the focus shifted to the binding of the sheaves. Each bundle had to be tied with enough tension to remain secure during transport, yet not so tight that it crushed the delicate heads of the grain. They used the dried, tempered straw from the previous year, a practice that reinforced the cycle of their work. To tie the new harvest, it was a tactile, familiar task. The labourers moved down the rows, gathering the fallen stalks into uniform sheaves, their hands moving with the practised grace of artisans. The fields, once a sea of standing gold, were transformed into orderly lines of bundled grain, ready to be gathered and moved to the threshing floors. The social dynamic during these hours was one of intense shared focus. There was no room for the distractions of the past. The entire community was operating as a singular, cohesive unit. The communication was sparse and functional, a nod to signal the end of a row, a quiet call to move to the next section of the field, but beneath the surface there was a profound sense of unity. They were reaping what they had sown, and the sight of the stacked sheaves was a tangible, overwhelming confirmation of their collective agency. The fear of famine, which had once felt like an insurmountable shadow, had been replaced by the heavy, satisfying reality of a bountiful harvest. Throughout the afternoon, the constant rhythmic labour was broken only by short restorative pauses in the shade of the hedgerows. They drank water from cool earthen jars and watched the sky, observing the way the light began to turn from the harsh brilliance of midday to the deep golden honey of late afternoon. These moments of rest were deeply quiet. They looked out over the fields and saw the evidence of their work, a landscape that was no longer an enigma but a ledger of their own persistence. The fields were being cleared in perfect, logical segments, matching the categories they had established in the storehouse. By the time the sun began its descent, the primary fields were cleared. The exhaustion that settled into their muscles was profound, but it was a good, honest tiredness. It was the feeling of a full day of meaningful work, a state of being that brought with it a sense of deep internal stillness. As they looked back over the stubble of the fields, they saw not the end of their labour, but the successful completion of the most significant phase of their year. They were gathering the grain, closing the circle of their stewardship, and ensuring the survival of their community through the winter to come. The harvest was more than just food. It was the final triumphant confirmation that they had mastered the rhythm of the land. The memory of the grain storehouse, now standing silent and expectant, served as a constant touchstone for the community. The simple straw tags that hung from the iron hoops were no longer just tools. They had become the physical anchors of a redefined relationship with their environment. Each knot and braid represented a moment of decision, a point where the community had chosen order over confusion. Looking back, the villagers recognized how these humble markers had fundamentally altered their perception. The storehouse was no longer a place of mystery or looming dread, but a repository of their own foresight. This shift in relationship was profound. They had moved from viewing the natural world as an unpredictable, often hostile force to seeing it as a partner in a cyclical agreement. The straw tags were the vocabulary of this agreement. By creating a system that could be read, touched, and understood by anyone, they had democratized the survival of their village. The tags removed the need for whispered questions or guessing games in the dark. They had transformed the grain from a source of anxiety into a source of tangible, documented wealth. Even as the harvest approached, the presence of these markers in their memory provided a sense of continuity. They carried the knowledge of the tight diamond and the flowing braid in their minds, a secret language of security that bonded them together. The tags were the physical embodiment of the Queen's insight that the complexity of survival could be decoded through the patient, artisanal application of simple materials. This lesson had seeped into the community's marrow, influencing how they approached not just the grain, but their tools, their homes, and even the way they spoke to one another. There was a quiet strength in knowing that the storehouse was ready to receive the coming harvest. The empty barrels, labelled and aligned, waited like vessels designed to hold the future. This preparation was a silent conversation between the past and the future, bridged by the present labour of the harvest. Every time a villager caught sight of the storehouse, they felt a surge of grounded confidence. They had proven to themselves that they were capable of governing their own destiny. The simple woven tags had done more than categorize grain. They had organized the chaotic potential of their lives into a manageable, sustainable, and peaceful existence, proving that even in a vast and often uncertain world, the most enduring solutions are frequently the most human-centered. The legacy of Fastrada's system was not to be found in monuments of stone or grand declarations, but in the enduring quiet power of practical innovation. The straw-woven tags had become more than a logistical necessity. They were a cultural shift, a testament to the belief that even the most daunting challenges of survival could be met with ingenuity and human-centered design. By placing the ability to organize and understand their world into the hands of every villager, the Queen had fostered a community that no longer felt like subjects of the climate, but active participants in their own continuity. This legacy resided in the way a farmer now taught his child to weave a knot, passing down not just a technique, but a philosophy of stewardship. It was the understanding that order is an artisanal craft, one that requires patience, observation, and an unwavering commitment to the details. The system had survived the change of seasons because it was intuitive, requiring no specialized authority to interpret. It was knowledge that lived within the collective memory, held in the calloused palms of those who worked the land and the woven fibers that hung in the storehouse. As the years would pass, the straw language would likely fade into the tapestry of village folklore, but its impact remained indelible. It had broken the cycle of scarcity that had defined the previous generations, replacing fear with a reliable, predictable abundance. The true brilliance of the innovation lay in its humility. It did not seek to impose dominance over nature, but to create a bridge of understanding between human effort and natural growth. This was the enduring power of the system. It aligned the community with the Earth's own rhythms, ensuring that their prosperity was a reflection of their discipline and their care. Looking back, the community recognized that their resilience was built on this foundation of practical intelligence. They had learned that when a problem seems overwhelming, the answer often lies in breaking it down into its constituent parts, to label, to sort, to understand, and to act. This had given them a sense of internal stability that would persist long after the specific harvest had been consumed. Fastrada's intervention had given them the tools to not only survive but to thrive, establishing a culture where the value of labor was matched by the wisdom of organization. The system stood as a quiet, revolutionary model of leadership, demonstrating that the most effective way to lead is to empower those you serve to understand and master their own existence. The quietude that settled over the village during this successful season was not an absence of sound, but an absence of dissonance. After the long, grueling months of winter storage, the meticulous planning of the spring, and the relentless, rhythmic labor of the harvest, the community had reached a state of profound, restorative peace. This was the harvest of their collective discipline, a deep internal silence that allowed the members of the village to exist without the constant gnawing itch of worry. The atmosphere was no longer charged with the frantic energy of survival, but with the steady, resonant hum of meaningful work completed. This peace was a sensory experience. It was found in the stillness of the afternoon when the wind moved across the empty, stubbled fields in soft, whispering currents. It was found in the interior of the storehouse where the air, thick with the nutty, grounding scent of the new harvest, felt cool and immutable. It was a peace that felt hard-won, a tranquility that had been earned through the persistent application of intention. The farmers could walk through their village and recognize in the steady gaze of their neighbors the shared understanding that they had finally mastered the chaos that had once held them captive. For the laborers, this quietude was the ultimate reward. They had discovered that peace is not merely the absence of conflict or the cessation of labor. It is the result of labor that is aligned with one's needs and one's purpose. Their work had been hard, yes. It had required strength, endurance, and at times significant sacrifice. But because it was meaningful and clearly understood, it had not drained their spirits. Instead, it had anchored them. The peace they felt was the natural outcome of a life where the foundations were secure, the objectives were clear, and the tools of survival were well maintained. They spent their evenings in a state of contented reflection. There was a sense of profound rightness in seeing the smoke rise from the hearths, knowing that the barns were full of grain categorized by their own hands. The social fabric of the village had tightened, becoming resilient and supportive, as if the shared effort of sorting and reaping had woven them together as firmly as the straw tags they had mastered. This was the true silent success of the season. The community had not only survived the year, but they had also come to understand their own worth as stewards of the land. In this quiet, prosperous autumn, they finally understood that the highest form of rest is the rest of a soul that has fulfilled its obligations to itself and its environment, leaving them entirely at ease as they looked forward to the coming winter, confident in their capacity to endure and thrive. The final harvest was gathered with a quiet, solemn grace, the last of the grain safely ensconced within the barrels that had been so thoughtfully prepared. As the village hearths began to burn brighter against the encroaching chill of late autumn, the community looked back upon the season with a sense of quiet closure. The granary, once a site of anxiety and confusion, now stood as a silent, steady testament to the transformation of their lives. It was filled to capacity with labelled, organised bounty, and in that fullness the people found the ultimate security they had sought for so long. The cycle had truly closed. From the first tentative planning in the depths of winter to the golden culmination of the autumn reaping, the people had remained steadfast in their commitment to the system. They had seen the earth respond to their care, the fields move through their natural progressions, and the harvest return the favour of their diligence. The landscape, once scarred by the chaotic hodgepodge of mismanaged crops, was now neatly shorn and resting in the crisp, cool air, waiting for the coming frost to begin the process anew. It was a return to abundance, but more importantly, a return to the natural ancient rhythm of the seasons. As the villagers gathered for the final time to seal the storehouse, there was no fanfare, only a shared, knowing nod. They had learned that the most profound victories are often the ones that occur in the quiet, dusty corners of daily labour. The straw tags, now dry and fragile, hung as silent witnesses to the resilience of the community. They had served their purpose well, acting as the humble bridge between a past of uncertainty and a future of sustainable, grounded peace. The farmers knew that the work would return when the spring sun hit the soil, but for now they were content to step back and simply exist in the quietude they had cultivated. Farewell, then, to this year of hard-won discovery. The landscape, though ancient and often indifferent, had been made a little more legible by human hands, and the people, once fragmented by fear, had been brought together by the simple, enduring logic of their shared purpose. They turned from the storehouse and walked back toward their homes, the evening light soft and forgiving across the valley. There was no need for grand words or lasting monuments. The proof of their success was in the full barrels, the warm hearths, and the unshakable, quiet confidence that now resided in their hearts. The cycle was complete, the community was secure, and the winter, no longer a spectre of famine, was simply a time to rest, to reflect, and to wait for the next, inevitable, and beautiful turn of the world. Centuries have passed since the echoes of Fastrada's grain stores faded into the pages of history, yet the fundamental truth of her system remains etched into the human experience. Complexity is often a barrier to resilience, while simplicity is its gateway. In our modern age, we are besieged by a different kind of hodgepodge, a deluge of data, notifications, and fragmented information that mimics the chaos of those early medieval fields. Just as the farmers once stood paralyzed before barrels of unlabeled seeds, we often stand before an endless stream of digital inputs, struggling to discern which grains of information are vital for our survival and which are merely chaff. The lesson of the straw tags resonates with startling clarity today. We too are in desperate need of our own tactile language, simple intuitive methods to categorize and order our lives. We have traded the physical storehouse for the digital workspace, yet the psychological weight remains identical. When we fail to label our intentions, we lose our way in the field. When we lack a clear system to organize our daily burdens, we succumb to the same anxieties that once kept the village farmers awake in the long dark hours. The genius of the Queen's initiative was not in the straw itself, but in the restoration of human agency. By returning to the analog, to the act of physically sorting, labeling, and organizing, we can reclaim the peace that Fastrada's people found. Whether it is the deliberate act of writing down our goals, the curation of our physical environments, or the practice of intentional, focused labor, the core principle remains the same. We must find our own version of the diamond knot and the woven braid, a personal system that turns the overwhelming noise of the modern world into a legible, manageable map. In doing so, we move from being passive consumers of our circumstances to active stewards of our own mental landscape, proving that the ancient need for order is as timeless as the seasons themselves. In our contemporary landscape, the hodgepodge has mutated into the architecture of multitasking, a relentless, fragmented state of being that mirrors the inefficiency of the unmanaged fields of the 8th century. We are constantly pressured to switch contexts, to juggle disparate demands, and to hold too many variables in our working memory at once. Fastrada's farmers struggled because they tried to treat all seeds as if they were identical, ignoring the specific, nuanced requirements of each variety. Similarly, we often collapse the distinctions between our various tasks, treating the profound and the trivial with the same level of urgency. This flatness of priority is the primary source of modern burnout. The antidote, as demonstrated by the straw tags, is the practice of intentional categorization. When we categorize our responsibility, not merely by urgency but by their specific botanical needs, we begin to treat our time with the same reverence the farmers treated their soil. Some tasks, like the diamond-marked wheat, require the resilience of deep, focused effort in the most challenging conditions of our day. Others, like the moisture-loving barley, thrive in the steady, rhythmic flow of routine work. By creating a physical or conceptual system that recognizes these differences, we stop fighting against our own nature. We stop attempting to grow wheat in a swamp. This is the hidden wisdom of the grain storehouse. Clarity is an act of self-preservation. When we label our commitments, we are essentially saying to ourselves, I know what this is, and I know where it belongs. This simple act reduces the friction of decision-making. It transforms the overwhelming amorphous cloud of things to do into a series of logical, manageable rows. We reclaim the ability to walk through our days with the same steady, purposeful gait as the farmers in the valley. We move from a state of reactive fragmentation to one of proactive, grounded stewardship, proving that the most advanced technology for human productivity is not a new application or algorithm, but the age-old human-centered capacity to distinguish, to name, and to order. The ultimate legacy of the grain storehouse is the realization that peace is not an accident, it is a structure. In the modern world, we often wait for peace to arrive as if it were a change in the weather, hoping that our anxieties will lift if we just wait long enough. Fastrada's story reveals that peace is, in fact, an architectural achievement. It is built from the ground up, starting with the willingness to organize one's own reality and to commit to a rhythm that honors both the worker and the work. The straw language was never about the straw. It was about the power of intentionality to turn a chaotic existence into a meaningful life. As we look toward the future, the lesson of the valley is that we are the masters of our own harvest. We possess the same capacity as those 8th century farmers to observe our conditions, to adapt our tools, and to cultivate the environment in which we exist. Whether we are managing a household, leading a team, or simply trying to find equilibrium in a hyper-connected society, the principles remain constant. Identify what is essential, categorize your resources with care, and embrace the rhythm of the seasons. When we do this, we find that we are no longer drifting at the mercy of the elements, but are instead anchored by the clarity of our own design. We conclude this exploration with the recognition that the ancient and the modern are not so far apart. The hunger for certainty, the fear of the unknown, and the profound quiet joy of a job well done are universal experiences that bridge the gap of 1,000 years. By adopting the discipline of the storehouse, by sorting our priorities as carefully as the farmers sorted their seeds, we too can build a granary that holds the abundance of our own potential. As we close this chapter, let us carry forward the wisdom of the valley, that even in the vastest, most uncertain world, we have the power to create a space of order, to plant with purpose, and to finally truly find our rest. The channel History Under Moonlight is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as ancient mysteries, forgotten chronicles, and the calm, reflective moments of our shared past through time.